A millionaire invites a homeless mother and son into his mansion during a snowstorm, but when he discovers an old photograph showing the woman's connection to his dead daughter, his whole world turns upside down. But before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe and comment below from where are you watching from today. Edward Harrington stood at his living room window, watching the snow fall on his empty driveway. His mansion was too big for just one person, but that's all he had been for the past 20 years. At 65, his silver hair and expensive suit couldn't hide the sadness in his eyes. Sure, he had more money than he could ever spend, but what good was it when he had no one to share it with? He thought about Emma, his daughter, who he'd lost in a car accident 2 decades ago. The fight they'd had the night before still haunted him. He'd been too focused on his business, too strict with her choices. Now he'd never get the chance to make things right. "Mr. Harrington?" Martha, his housekeeper, called from the doorway. "Your dinner is ready." "Thank you, Martha. You can go home early today. The weather's getting worse." Martha hesitated. "Are you sure you'll be all right alone?" Edward forced a smile. "I've been alone for 20 years. One more night won't kill me." After Martha left, Edward sat in his huge dining room, pushing food around on his plate. The television droned on in the background, talking about the worst winter storm in 50 years. He was about to head upstairs when something caught his eye through the security camera feed playing on his tablet. There at his front gate stood a woman and a teenage boy. They were barely visible through the snow, but he could see they weren't dressed for this weather. The woman wore a thin coat that had seen better days, and the boy was shivering in just a hoodie. Edward's first instinct was to call security. That's what his business mind told him to do, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the woman held the boy close, trying to shield him from the wind. Or maybe it was 20 years of loneliness finally catching up with him. He grabbed his coat and headed for the front door. The walk to the gate felt longer than usual, the snow crunching under his expensive boots. As he got closer, he could see them better. The woman had dark circles under her eyes, but a gentle face that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place it. The boy looked about 15 with defiant eyes that couldn't quite hide his fear. "You can't stay out here in this storm," Edward said, his voice gruffer than he meant it to be. "There's a shelter downtown." "We tried," the woman interrupted, her voice soft but proud. "They're full. We'll move along, sir. We don't want any trouble." The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Come on, Mom, we can try the subway station." Something in Edward's chest tightened. Maybe it was the way she said, "Mom," or the way the boy tried to act tough even though his lips were turning blue. Or maybe it was just that he was tired of eating alone in that big, empty house. "Wait," he called as they turned to leave. "I have plenty of room, and it's warm inside." The woman hesitated, studying his face. "We don't take charity, Mr. Harrington, Edward Harrington, and it's not charity, it's basic human decency during a storm." He paused, then added, "Please, I'd feel terrible if something happened to you both out here." The boy spoke up. "Mom, we should go, just for tonight." After what felt like forever, the woman nodded. "I'm Olivia," she said, "and this is my son, Ethan." As Edward led them up the long driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening. He'd made billions trusting his gut in business deals. Now that same instinct told him his life was about to change. He didn't know then how right he was. He didn't know that Olivia was a talented artist who'd lost her way. He didn't know that Ethan would remind him so much of himself at that age. And he certainly didn't know that his simple act of kindness would uncover a connection to his past that would change all their lives forever. But that's the thing about lonely winter nights. Sometimes they have a way of bringing the right people together at exactly the right time. Inside, Edward asked his private chef to prepare hot soup and sandwiches. As he watched Olivia and Ethan warm up by the fireplace, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, his big empty house wouldn't be so empty anymore. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a story that would prove that it's never too late for second chances, and that sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it. Olivia woke up in a bed softer than anything she'd felt in years. For a moment she forgot where she was. The sunlight streaming through the fancy curtains made the room look like something from a magazine. Then she remembered. The storm, the kind stranger, the warm soup. She jumped out of bed, suddenly worried. Rich people didn't just take in strangers without wanting something in return. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. "Mom!" Ethan's voice came from the connecting door. He looked different in the clean clothes Edward's housekeeper had found for him. Cleaner, younger somehow. More like the boy he should have been if life had been kinder. I'm here, honey. Olivia hugged him tight. Did you sleep okay? Better than the shelter. Ethan pulled away, looking serious. But Mom, we can't stay here. Rich guys like him, they always want something. Olivia's heart ached. Her 15-year-old son shouldn't be so suspicious of kindness. But then again, his father had taught them both that lesson. A knock at the door made them both jump. Martha, the housekeeper, stuck her head in. Mr. Harrington would like to know if you'll join him for breakfast. Olivia started to make an excuse, but her stomach growled. When was the last time they'd had a real breakfast? We'll be right down, she found herself saying. The dining room looked different in the morning light. Edward sat at the head of the long table reading a newspaper. He looked up when they came in, and Olivia was struck again by the sadness in his eyes. This was not a happy man, despite all his wealth. Good morning, he said, folding his paper. I hope you both slept well. Very well, thank you. Olivia sat down stiffly. Mr. Harrington, we appreciate your kindness, but we should— Edward, he interrupted. Please call me Edward, and before you say anything else, look outside. They all turned to the window. The storm had left everything buried in white. The news on the small kitchen TV was talking about closed roads and power, outages across the city. The guest rooms are yours for as long as you need them, Edward said quietly. I have more space than I know what to do with anyway. Ethan spoke up, his voice hard. Why are you helping us? What do you want? Ethan, Olivia gasped, but Edward held up his hand. It's a fair question. He set down his coffee cup. The truth is, I've been alone in this house for 20 years. My daughter, Emma, she died in a car accident. We'd had a fight the night before. She was trying to tell me something important, but I was too busy with a business deal to listen. He looked down at his hands. I've regretted that every day since. The room went quiet except for the TV's soft murmur. Olivia felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the smooth talk of someone with ulterior motives. This was raw pain, as real as her own. I don't want anything from you, Edward continued, except maybe the chance to do something good, to help someone who needs it, the way I should have helped my daughter. Ethan's face softened just a little. Olivia knew that look. He was thinking about all the times they'd gone hungry, all the nights in shelters or subway stations. We can stay until the road's clear, Olivia said finally. But I want to help, cooking, cleaning, something. Edward smiled, and some of the sadness left his eyes. Martha could use some help. But first, you both need proper winter clothes. We can go shopping when the road's clear. We don't need— Olivia started, but Edward cut her off. Please, let me do this. After breakfast, Martha showed Olivia around the kitchen. As she learned where everything went, Olivia noticed a door that had been left slightly open. Through it, she could see what looked like an art studio, dusty, with disuse. Easels stood like silent ghosts, and blank canvases leaned against the walls. That was Emma's room, Martha said softly. She loved to paint. Mr. Harrington hasn't been in there since— Olivia's fingers itched for a paintbrush. How long had it been since she'd painted anything? Not since Daniel had destroyed all her art supplies, calling her work worthless. Mom, Ethan appeared in the doorway. Mr. Harrington, I mean Edward. He says there's a library upstairs. Can I check it out? Of course, honey. Olivia watched him go, hope and fear fighting in her chest. They'd been burned by kindness before, but something about Edward's sadness, about this house full of memories and second chances, made her want to believe. In the other room, Edward watched them through the doorway, remembering another dark-haired woman who had loved art. Emma had been trying to tell him something that last night, something about her friend Clara, and a secret she'd been keeping. Now watching Olivia look longingly at the art studio, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu, but that would have to wait. For now, he had two people who needed help, and for the first time in 20 years, his big empty house felt a little less empty. A week had passed since the snowstorm, but Olivia and Ethan were still at the mansion. Every morning, Olivia told herself they should leave. Every evening, Edward found a reason for them to stay just one more day. The roads are still icy, he'd say, or another storm's coming. But they all knew the real reason. None of them wanted to be alone again. Olivia was in the kitchen helping Martha make dinner when Edward's business partner, Thomas Wheeler, showed up unannounced. Through the kitchen door, she could hear their conversation. Have you lost your mind, Ed? Thomas's voice was sharp. Taking in strangers. They could be after your money. They could be con artists. They're good people. Tom, Edward sounded tired. If you'd just meet them, like those good people who tried to scam you last year. The ones who almost cost you millions? Thomas lowered his voice, but Olivia could still hear him. I'm your friend, Ed. I'm just trying to protect you. Olivia's hands shook as she chopped vegetables. She'd known this would happen. Rich people had rich friends, and rich friends never trusted poor ones. Mum? Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. What's wrong? Before she could answer, Edward walked in with Thomas. Edward looked uncomfortable, but he managed to smile. For Olivia, Ethan, this is my friend Thomas Wheeler. He owns the biggest art gallery in the city. Thomas studied them like they were paintings he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. His eyes lingered on Olivia's worn sweater, one of her old ones since she'd refused to let Edward buy her new clothes. Nice to meet you, Olivia said quietly, turning back to her vegetables, but Ethan wasn't so polite. We're not trying to steal anything, he said, his voice hard. We're not thieves. Ethan, Olivia gasped, but Thomas just laughed. Direct, isn't he? Thomas turned to Edward. Like someone else I used to know. Edward's face softened. He reminds me of Emma sometimes. Something changed in Thomas's expression. At the mention of Emma's name, he looked at Olivia again, more carefully this time. You said your last name was Parker? Yes, Olivia answered, wondering why that mattered. Thomas pulled Edward into the hallway, but their voices still carried. Ed, do you remember Clara Parker, Emma's best friend from college? Olivia dropped her knife. Clara Parker was her mother's name. Clara? Edward's voice shook. Of course I remember Clara. She was here that last night when Emma and I fought. She was trying to tell me something about Clara, but I wouldn't listen. Olivia's head spun. Her mother had never talked much about her college days, but she'd mentioned a friend named Emma once or twice. Emma, who'd helped them secretly after Olivia's father died, who'd sent money and letters until… Mom? Ethan touched her arm. You're crying. Olivia wiped her eyes quickly. In the hallway, Edward and Thomas were still talking, their voices getting more excited. Clara's daughter would be about her age, Thomas was saying. And look at her, she has Clara's eyes, Ed, and Emma's talent for art. Haven't you noticed how she looks at that old studio? Martha, who'd been quietly working nearby, spoke up. I saw her sketching yesterday, on a napkin at breakfast. She's good, Mr. Harrington. Real good. Edward appeared in the doorway, his face pale. Olivia, he said softly, was your mother's name Clara? Clara Parker from Riverside College? Olivia nodded, her throat tight. She died 3 years ago, cancer. And your father? Died when I was little. Mom raised me alone until she stopped. The memories of those hard years after her mother's death still too painful. Edward sat down heavily in a kitchen chair. Emma was trying to tell me about Clara that night, about some secret they were keeping. She'd been sending money to someone, but she wouldn't tell me who. I was so angry about the secrets, about her using her trust fund that way. Mom got money every month, Ethan said suddenly. Until 3 years ago. It always came in a pink envelope with a butterfly stamp. She said it was from an angel. Edward's eyes filled with tears. Emma loved butterflies. She had a special stamp she used on all her letters. The kitchen went quiet. Even Thomas looked stunned. Finally, he cleared his throat. Well, Ed, still think they're con artists. But Edward wasn't listening. He was staring at Olivia like he was seeing a ghost. You have her smile, he whispered. Emma's smile. I noticed it that first night, but didn't want to think about why. Olivia felt like the room was spinning. I don't understand. Why would your daughter send us money? Why would she help us in secret? Before Edward could answer, they heard the front door slam. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Olivia, a man's voice bellowed. I know you're here. Ethan went pale. Dad, he whispered. Olivia grabbed her son's hand. She knew that voice. She heard it in her nightmares. Daniel had found them. The perfect life they'd been building was about to shatter, just like every other time they'd tried to start over. But this time was different. This time they weren't alone. Edward stood up, his face hard. Martha, take them upstairs. Tom, call security. No one, he said firmly, is going to hurt my family, not again. Daniel Parker stood in Edward's grand entrance hall, dripping melted snow onto the marble floor. His expensive suit couldn't hide the meanness in his face, the way his eyes darted around looking for something to break. Where's my wife? He shouted. Olivia, get down here. Edward stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Parker, you're trespassing on private property. Daniel's laugh was ugly. Trespassing? That's rich coming from the man hiding my wife. And son, what did she tell you? That I'm the bad guy? That poor little Olivia needs saving? You lost the right to call me your wife when you put me in the hospital, Olivia's voice rang out from the stairs. She stood there with Ethan, both of them pale but standing tall. Martha hovered behind them, looking worried. Edward's fists clenched. Hospital. He looked at Olivia, saw the way she held herself, ready to run, saw the old fear in her eyes. That was an accident, Daniel said smoothly. I've changed, baby. I've been to therapy, got my anger under control. Come home. Home? Ethan's voice cracked. You mean that apartment where you threw Mom's paintings out the window, where you said you'd kill us both if we tried to leave? Thomas, who'd been quietly calling security on his phone, stepped forward. The police are on their way, Mr. Parker, and I've already taken pictures of you breaking and entering. My law firm will be very interested in adding those to Olivia's case file. Daniel's smooth mask slipped. Case file? What case file? The one documenting every bruise, every hospital visit, every police report. Thomas smiled coldly. I may run an art gallery, but I still have friends in the DA's office. Friends who are very interested in domestic violence cases. You can't prove anything, Daniel snarled, but his eyes kept darting to the door. Actually, Edward said quietly, we can. He pulled out his phone, showed Daniel the screen. Security. Cameras. They've been recording everything you just said, everything you just admitted to. Daniel lunged forward, trying to grab the phone. But Edward was faster, stepping back while Thomas moved to block Daniel's path. Don't make this worse for yourself, Thomas warned. 2 security guards appeared at the front door, followed by police cars pulling up outside, their lights flashing blue and red through the windows. Dad? Ethan said, his voice stronger now. Just go, please. Something in Daniel's face changed when he looked at his son. For a moment, he almost looked human. Ethan, buddy, I'm just trying to keep our family together. No? Ethan shook his head. You're trying to control us, like always, but we're not afraid anymore. The police came in then and everything happened quickly. They arrested Daniel for breaking and entering, for violating the old restraining order Olivia had gotten years ago. As they led him out, he kept shouting about his rights, about how he'd get them back. When the noise finally died down, Olivia sank onto the stairs, shaking. Ethan sat next to her, and Edward noticed how the boy shifted slightly, putting himself between his mother and the door, always protecting her, even now. I'm sorry, Olivia whispered. I should have told you about him, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd think we were too much trouble. Edward sat down next to them. Olivia, look at me. You're not trouble. You're family. Family? She looked up, tears in her eyes. Yes. Edward took a deep breath. I think that's what Emma was trying to tell me that night. About Clara, about you. She must have known somehow, must have been helping you even then. Thomas cleared his throat. Ed, remember those trust fund withdrawals you were so angry about? The ones Emma made every month. They match the timeline of when Olivia says they started getting help. After my father died, Olivia said softly. Mom was struggling. Then one day this money started coming. Mom said it was from an old friend, but she never said who, just that it was our angel. Emma was like that. Edward smiled sadly. Always trying to help people, even when I told her she was being too trusting. That's what we fought about that last night. She wanted to use more of her trust fund to help someone, and I said no, said she was being foolish. Martha appeared with tea, her face soft with concern. As she poured, she said, Miss Emma came to me that night, after the fight, said she had to go meet someone, had to explain why the money might stop. Coming, she was crying. Edward's face went pale. The accident, it was on her way to that meeting, wasn't it? She was going to meet Clara, to talk about Olivia. The room went quiet. Outside, the police cars were pulling away, taking Daniel with them. But his shadow still hung over them, a reminder that things weren't over yet. What happens now? Ethan asked, his voice small. Thomas spoke up. Now we make sure your father can't hurt you again. I've already called Sarah Chen. She's the best family lawyer in the state. She'll help us make sure those restraining orders are ironclad this time. And, Edward added, you both stay here, where it's safe, where you belong. Olivia looked around the grand entrance hall, at Martha's kind face, at Thomas's determined expression, at Edward's gentle eyes. For the first time in years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt safe. The art studio, she said suddenly. Emma's old studio. Would it be okay if... It's yours, Edward said immediately. Emma would have wanted that. She was trying to help you follow your dreams, even if she had to do it in secret. Let me help you now, out in the open. As if on cue, The sun broke through the clouds outside, sending rays of light through the stained glass windows. They painted the marble floor in colors, blues and golds, like a painting coming to life. But this was just the beginning. Daniel wouldn't give up easily, and there were still so many questions about Emma, about Clara, about the past. Yet somehow, sitting there on the stairs with her son and these people who'd become her protectors, Olivia knew they'd face it all together. Sometimes, she thought, looking at Edward's face, family isn't just about blood. Sometimes it's about who stands beside you when the storms come. And sometimes, just sometimes, those storms lead you exactly where you need to be. The morning after Daniel's arrest, Olivia stood in front of Emma's art studio door. Her hand shook. As she reached for the handle, behind her Edward waited quietly, holding a ring of old keys. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. This was her special place. "Emma would have wanted another artist to use it," Edward said, softly. "Especially you." The door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust covered everything. The easels, the paint bottles, the canvases stacked against the wall. But even through the dust, Olivia could feel the creativity that once filled this space. "I'll leave you to explore," Edward said. "Take all the time you need." Alone in the studio, Olivia walked slowly around the room. Her fingers trailed over old paintbrushes, dried-out paint tubes, sketches. Left unfinished, on a shelf she found a collection of photographs. Emma smiled out from them, a pretty young woman with Edward's kind eyes and long dark hair. In one photo, Emma stood with another woman, both of them laughing at the camera. Olivia's heart stopped. The other woman was her mother, Clara, looking younger and happier than Olivia had ever seen her. "Mum?" Ethan's voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, holding something. "Look what Martha found in the attic." It was an old pink box, covered in butterfly stickers. Inside were dozens of letters, all written in the same flowing handwriting. Olivia recognized her mother's writing immediately. "Dear Emma," she read out loud, "thank you for everything. I wish I could tell your father the truth, but I promised you I wouldn't. Olivia's growing so fast, she painted her first picture today. She has your gift." Tears fell onto the old paper. "She knew me," Olivia whispered. "Emma knew me when I was little." "There's more," Ethan said, pulling out a thick envelope. Inside was a legal document, a trust fund set up in Olivia's name, signed by Emma just days before her death. "I never knew," Olivia said, her voice breaking. "The money stopped coming after she died, but I never knew it was her." "I found something else," Martha said from the doorway. She held an old diary. "It was in Miss Emma's desk. I think you both need to read it." Edward appeared behind Martha, his face pale. "I've been reading it all morning. Olivia, there's something you need to know about your father. Your real father." Olivia sat down hard on an old paint-splattered stool. "What do you mean, my real father? Mom always said he died when I was a baby." "According to Emma's diary," Edward said gently. "That wasn't true. Your mother was running from someone dangerous. Emma helped her hide, helped her create a new life. That's why they kept everything secret, even from me." Ethan picked up an old sketch that had fallen from the diary. It showed a man's face, drawn with quick, angry strokes. At the bottom, Emma had written one word: monster. "Richard Blake," Edward read from the diary. "He was a powerful man, a business rival of mine. I never knew. Emma wrote that he threatened Clara, threatened you when you were just a baby. That's why they ran." Olivia's head spun. Everything she thought she knew about her past was unraveling. "Is he still alive?" "No," Thomas said, walking in. He held a stack of old newspapers. "Richard Blake died 10 years ago in prison. Tax fraud, embezzlement, and," he hesitated, "attempted murder charges. Clara's testimony helped put him away, but she testified anonymously, changed her name right after." "So that's why," Olivia whispered. "Why we moved so much when I was little. Why Mom was always looking over her shoulder. And why Emma set up that trust fund," Edward added. "She was making sure you'd be taken care of if anything ever happened to her or Clara." Olivia stood up suddenly, walking to the windows. She pulled open the heavy curtains, letting sunlight flood the room for the first time in 20 years. Dust motes danced in the light, and the old paints and brushes seemed to come alive. "Mom?" Ethan touched her arm. "Are you okay?" Olivia turned to him, really looked at him. He had her eyes, her mother's chin, but nothing of Daniel in him. She thanked God for that every day. "I'm better than okay," she said. I finally understand why this place felt like home from the first moment. Why Emma's painting of the garden looked so familiar. She picked up an old canvas, wiped away the dust. Mum had a copy of this in our apartment when I was little. I used to stare at it for hours, dreaming about the kind of life where people had gardens like that. Edward walked over, looked at the painting. Emma gave that to Clara right before the accident. Said something about promises and new beginnings. Mr. Harrington? One of the security guards appeared at the door. There's a detective here to see you about Mr. Parker's case. Edward squeezed Olivia's shoulder. I'll handle this. You stay here. Make this space yours again. After he left, Olivia picked up a paintbrush. It felt right in her hand, like coming home. On a dusty easel, she found a blank canvas. What are you going to paint? Ethan asked. Olivia looked around the studio, at the photos of Emma and her mother, at the letters full of secrets and love, at the son who'd been her strength through everything. Our story, she said softly. All of it. The truth about the past, the hope for the future, everything. She didn't know then that the painting she started that day would change all their lives. Didn't know that Thomas would take one look at it and insist on putting it in his gallery. Didn't know that it would lead to questions about old secrets that some people wanted to keep buried. But for now, in that sun-filled studio, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future, Olivia finally felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. 2 months had passed since Olivia discovered the truth about her past. She'd spent every day in Emma's studio, painting like a woman possessed. Tonight was her big moment. Thomas had arranged for her work to be shown at his gallery. "Mom, we're going to be late," Ethan called from outside the studio door. He was dressed in a new suit that Edward had insisted on buying him. "Everyone's waiting." Olivia stared at her reflection in the old mirror. She hardly recognized herself in the elegant blue dress Martha had helped her choose. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Coming," she called back, taking one last look at the main piece of her collection. It was a large canvas showing a mother and daughter running through darkness, while butterflies made of light showed them the way. She'd titled it, Emma's Promise. Edward was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. These days, the sadness in his eyes was less noticeable. Having Olivia and Ethan in the house had brought life back to the old mansion. "You look beautiful," he said, offering her his arm. "Just like Emma on her first gallery showing." The drive to Thomas's gallery was quiet. Olivia's mind kept going back to everything they'd learned. The detective handling Daniel's case had discovered more about Richard Blake, her real father. He'd been more than just a business rival to Edward. He'd been obsessed with destroying the Harrington family. "We're here," Edward said softly, bringing her back to the present. The gallery was packed. Thomas had invited all the right people. Art critics, collectors, society figures. Olivia felt their eyes on her as she walked in. "Remember," Thomas whispered, "you don't have to explain the paintings to anyone. Let them find their own meaning." But one painting was already drawing attention. It showed a young woman standing at a window, her face half hidden, while another woman reached for her from the shadows. Olivia had painted it after reading more of Emma's diary, learning how her mother had come to Emma for help that fateful night. "Extraordinary," a man's voice said behind her. "The emotion is so raw, so real." Olivia turned to find an elderly man studying the painting. Something about him seemed familiar. "James Blake," he introduced himself. "And you must be Olivia." Her heart stopped. Blake, the same last name as her real father. "I'm Richard's brother," he said quietly, "and I think we need to talk." Edward appeared at her side instantly, his face hard. "James, I didn't expect to see you here." "Come now, Edward. You didn't think you were the only one who's been looking for Clara's daughter all these years, did you?" Ethan moved closer to his mother, protective as always, but James held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I'm here to right an old wrong. Richard wasn't just my brother, he was my responsibility. I should have stopped him years ago before he hurt Clara, before he threatened you, Olivia." "Why now?" Olivia asked, her voice shaking. "Why come forward after all this time?" James pulled an old envelope from his pocket. "Because Emma wrote to me just before she died, asked me to look after you and Clara if anything happened to her. I tried to find you, but you disappeared. Clara was too scared to be found." "What do you want?" Edward demanded. "To give Olivia what's rightfully hers," James replied. "Richard left everything to me when he went to prison. I've spent years turning his dirty money into legitimate businesses, clean investments. It was always meant for you, Olivia. Emma made me promise. The room seemed to spin. More secrets, more revelations. Would it ever end? There's something else, James added. Something about the night Emma died. It wasn't an accident. The glass Olivia was holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the gallery floor. Around them, people turned to stare, but she barely noticed. What do you mean it wasn't an accident? Edward's voice was dangerous. Richard had her followed that night, James said heavily. He knew she was helping Clara hide. He meant to scare her, just scare her, but his men went too far. Edward staggered back like he'd been hit. 20 years of believing his daughter's death was an accident, and now... How dare you? Thomas started, but James cut him off. I have proof. Files, photos, everything. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right time. Waiting until I found Olivia. Mom! Ethan's voice was worried. You're pale. But Olivia wasn't listening. She was looking at her paintings, all those images of running, hiding, searching for light in darkness. She thought she was painting her mother's story, but maybe she'd been painting Emma's too. There's more, James said. About why Richard was so obsessed with destroying your family, Edward. About who Clara really was. About why Emma was so determined to protect them. Before he could continue, a commotion broke out near the gallery. Entrance. Security guards were rushing towards someone. He has a gun, someone screamed. Daniel's voice cut through the panic. If I can't have my family back, nobody can. Everything happened at once. Edward lunged for Olivia, trying to shield her. Ethan grabbed his mother's hand, pulling her toward the back exit. James moved surprisingly, fast for his age, knocking a painting aside to reveal a hidden door. This way, he shouted. There's a safe room. As security guards tackled Daniel, as people screamed and ran, as the truth about the past threatened to destroy everything again, Olivia had one clear thought. Emma had died trying to protect her. She wouldn't let anyone else make that sacrifice. Not Edward, not James, not anyone. It was time to stop running. But first, they had to survive the night. The safe room behind the gallery was small but secure. James Blake had installed it years ago, fearing something like this might happen. Now Olivia, Ethan, Edward and James huddled inside, listening to the chaos outside. How did Daniel get out of jail? Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Made bail this morning. Thomas's voice came through the security intercom. But we've got him now. Police are taking him away. Olivia sank onto a small bench, her beautiful dress crumpled, her hands trembling. He's never going to stop, is he? He will now, Edward said firmly. Attempted armed assault in front of 50 witnesses. He'll be in prison for years. James cleared his throat. Perhaps now we can discuss what I was trying to tell you. About Emma. About why all this happened. Edward's face hardened. You say, my daughter's death wasn't an accident. Prove it. James pulled out his phone, opened a folder of old files. Richard was obsessed with destroying you, Edward. But not for the reasons you think. It was about Clara. My mother? Olivia leaned forward. What about her? Clara wasn't just Emma's college friend, James said quietly. She was Richard's wife, his first wife. The room went silent. Olivia felt like she couldn't breathe. What? They married young, James continued. Richard was already showing signs of his temper, his need for control. Clara was pregnant with you when she finally got the courage to run. That's when she met Emma in college. Edward sat down heavily. Emma never told me. Clara begged her to keep it secret. Richard had already threatened to kill Clara if she ever left him. When he found out about the baby, James shook his head. Emma helped Clara disappear, used her trust fund to set them up with new identities. But why? Edward demanded. Why did Richard hate me so much? Because Clara was supposed to be his way into your company. Richard wanted to merge his company with yours. When Clara ran, when the marriage fell apart, you signed the merger with Thompson Industries instead. Richard lost millions. Olivia's mind was spinning. So my father, Richard Blake, he killed Emma because she helped us. His men forced her car off the road, James said heavily. They were supposed to just scare her, get her to tell them where Clara was. But Emma refused. She went over that cliff protecting your secret. Edward stood up suddenly, pacing the small room. All these years, I blamed myself for that fight, for not listening when she tried to tell me about Clara. She wanted to tell you everything, James said. That last night, she'd finally convinced Clara it was time. That's where she was going. To meet Clara, to bring her to you, to explain everything. Why didn't Clara come forward after Emma died? Olivia asked. Fear, James replied simply. Richard's men had already found her once before. That's why you moved so much when you were little. Then she met Daniel, another controlling man, Olivia whispered. Just like Richard. The security intercom crackled. All clear, Thomas announced. Daniel's gone. Police want statements from everyone. They emerged from the safe room to find the gallery in chaos. Paintings had been knocked from walls, glass crunched underfoot. But Olivia's main piece, Emma's Promise, still hung untouched. As police officers took their statements, Olivia couldn't stop staring at the painting, the butterflies leading the way through darkness. Had she known somehow? Had some part of her remembered Emma's butterfly-stamped letters? There's more, James said quietly while the others were distracted. About why Emma was so determined to help Clara. He handed Olivia an old photograph. It showed 3 young people, Richard, Clara, and Edward. They all went to college together, James explained, before Richard showed his true nature, before Clara had to choose between them. Olivia looked at Edward with new eyes. The way he'd taken them in that snowy night, the immediate connection. It hadn't just been about Emma. He loved her, Olivia realized. Edward loved my mother. Still does, I'd say. James nodded toward Edward, who was watching Olivia with the same protective look he'd had in all the old photos of Emma. Some loves never die. They just wait for the right time. Just then, Thomas rushed in, his face pale. Hey, you need to see this, he said, holding up his tablet. Someone at the opening was a reporter. They've published everything about Richard Blake, about Emma's death, about Olivia being his heir. Edward took charge immediately. Get your security team on it, Tom. James will need those files, everything you have. Olivia, he turned to her, his face softening. What do you want to do? Olivia looked around the gallery, at her paintings that told a story she'd only just begun to understand, at her son, standing strong despite his fear, at James offering answers to questions she'd never known to ask, at Edward, who'd loved and lost and found a second chance at family. No more running, she said firmly. No more hiding. It's time everyone knew the truth. She walked to her painting, touched one of the butterflies she'd painted leading the way through darkness. Emma died protecting us, she said. The least we can do is live the life she wanted for us, free from fear, free from secrets. Edward came to stand beside her. Together, he said. It wasn't a question. Together, Olivia agreed. Outside, camera flashes started going off as reporters gathered. Tomorrow their story would be everywhere. But for tonight, in this gallery surrounded by art that told their truth, they were just a family, broken and healing, wounded and strong. And somewhere, Olivia thought, Emma was watching. Her secret keeper, her guardian angel, could finally rest. The truth was out, and love had found its way home. The morning after the gallery incident, the headlines were everywhere. Harrington heir revealed, lost daughter of business tycoon found. Murder at the mansion, 20-year-old death of Emma. Harrington not an accident. Blake fortune finds new heir, billions at stake. Olivia sat in Edward's kitchen, staring at the newspapers spread across the table. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from reporters. Outside, news vans lined the street. I've had the security team double the patrols, Edward said, pouring her a cup of coffee. No one gets through those gates without clearance. How do you live like this? Olivia asked. With everyone watching, everyone wanting something? You get used to it, Edward smiled sadly. Though I never wanted this for you. Martha bustled in with fresh muffins, her face worried. That nice reporter from Channel 5 is back. Says she knew Emma in school. They all say that now, Thomas grumbled, walking in with his laptop. But we have bigger problems. Richard Blake's old partners are calling emergency board meetings. They're challenging Olivia's claim to the Blake fortune. James Blake looked up from his own stack of papers. Let them try. I've got DNA tests, birth certificates, everything we need to prove Olivia is Richard's daughter. I don't want his money, Olivia said quietly. I don't want anything from him. It's not about want, James replied. It's about justice. Richard destroyed lives to build that fortune. Now it can do some good. Ethan came downstairs looking worried. Mom, kids at school are talking. Someone posted old pictures of Dad, of Daniel, from when he hurt you. Olivia's hands shook so badly, she almost dropped her coffee cup. Those pictures, hospital photos from the night she'd finally gotten the courage to press charges, were supposed to be sealed. I'll handle it, Thomas said immediately. We'll get them taken down. No, Olivia stood up suddenly. No more hiding. No more shame. She looked at her son. What happened to us wasn't our fault. Let people see. Let them understand. Edward touched her shoulder gently. Are you sure? Once it's out there. Emma died protecting our secrets, Olivia said. Maybe if she'd told you everything that night, if she hadn't had to carry it alone. She took a deep breath. I want to do an interview. Tell our whole story. Sarah Chen called, Thomas mentioned. The morning shows are offering exclusive interviews. She thinks we should, but Olivia was already shaking her head. Not them. I want to do it here, in Emma's studio, with my paintings telling the story. James nodded slowly. It's good. Personal, controlled. We choose what to share. I'll be right beside you, Edward promised. Just then, Martha rushed back in. Miss Olivia, you need to see this. She turned up the TV volume. A familiar face filled the screen, Rachel Blake, Richard's second wife. It's all lies, Rachel was saying to reporters. Richard Blake was a good man. This woman, this so-called daughter, she's just after his money. Ask yourself, why now? Why wait until both Richard and Clara are dead to come forward? Turn it off, Edward growled, but Olivia stopped him. No, let me hear what she says. Rachel's perfectly made-up face twisted with fake concern. And poor Emma Harrington. To drag her name into this, to accuse Richard of murder after all. These years, it's disgusting. If Clara Parker had any real evidence, why didn't she come forward when Emma died? Because she was protecting her daughter, Edward said to the TV. Because she knew what Richard was capable of. I knew that woman. Was trouble, Martha muttered. Always hanging around the mansion after Emma died, trying to get her hooks into you, Mr. Edward. Olivia turned sharply. What? Rachel was Richard's trophy wife, James explained. After Clara left him, he married someone he could control. But Rachel had ambitions of her own. When Richard went to prison, she tried to take over his company. When that failed, she set her sights on Edward. She wanted the merger to happen one way or another, Thomas added. But Edward never gave her the time of day. On TV, Rachel was still talking. I challenge this woman to prove her claims. Prove she's Richard's daughter. Prove any of these ridiculous stories about Emma. Olivia stood up, her face set. Call the studio, set up the interview. I want Rachel Blake to see exactly who I am and what I can prove. She walked to Emma's studio, her sanctuary in the chaos. The morning sun streamed through the windows, lighting up her paintings. New canvases waited, blank and full of possibility. Picking up a brush, Olivia began to paint. This time, she wasn't painting the past. She was painting the future. A future where secrets couldn't hurt them anymore, where truth, however painful, set them free. Edward found her there hours later, surrounded by fresh paintings. They showed Rachel's sneering face, Daniel's rage, Richard's cruelty, but also Emma's love, Clara's courage, Edward's kindness. Light defeating darkness, truth overcoming lies. These are powerful, Edward said softly. Are you sure you want to show them? Emma used her art to send messages, Olivia replied, to hide clues about who we really were. Now I'll use mine, to tell the truth. She touched the butterfly pendant Edward had given her, found in Emma's jewelry box, meant for the daughter of my heart, the note had said. Rachel Blake thinks she can scare me with threats and lies. Olivia's voice was strong. She has no idea what real strength is, what real family means. Outside, reporters still waited. Rachel Blake still plotted. The future was uncertain. But here in Emma's studio, surrounded by art and love and truth, Olivia finally understood what Emma had tried to teach her all those years ago. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply letting your light shine, no matter how dark the world seems. And her light, it was just beginning to glow. The day of the interview dawned bright and clear. Emma's studio had been transformed, lights and cameras everywhere, but Olivia's paintings still dominated the space. She'd insisted on that. 5 minutes to air, the producer called out. Mrs. Blake just arrived. Olivia's stomach twisted. Rachel Blake had demanded to be part of the interview, threatening to sue the network if they didn't include her. Now she stood in the doorway, elegant. In a designer suit, her smile as fake as her sympathy. Ready? Edward squeezed Olivia's hand. Ready, Olivia nodded, touching the butterfly pendant at her neck. The famous reporter, Linda Chen, settled into her chair. We're going live in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, America, Linda began. We're coming to you live from the Harrington mansion, where a story of love, loss, and long-buried secrets is finally coming to light. The cameras panned across Olivia's paintings as Linda introduced the story. The first questions were easy, about Olivia's art, about meeting Edward that snowy night. Then Linda turned to Rachel. Mrs. Blake, You've called these allegations against your late husband disgusting lies. Yet we have DNA proof that Olivia is Richard Blake's daughter. How do you explain that? Rachel's perfect smile never wavered. DNA can be faked, just like these convenient stories about Emma Harrington's death. Where's the proof? Right here, James Blake stepped forward, carrying a thick folder. Police reports, witness statements, phone records showing Richard's men following Emma that night, and this, he pulled out an old cassette tape. Emma was wearing a wire that night. She knew Richard's men were following her. She recorded everything. Rachel's face went pale. That's not possible. I found it in Richard's safe after he died, James said, along with this letter confessing everything. He wrote it in prison. Too much of a coward to ever send it. Linda leaned forward. Can we play the tape? Olivia held her breath as James pressed play. Static crackled, then Emma's voice filled the studio. I know you're following me. Tell Richard he can't hide the truth anymore. Clara's daughter deserves to know who she is, what her father did. A man's voice responded. Mr. Blake says to give him the girl's location, and nobody gets hurt. Never. Emma's voice was fierce. I'll never let him hurt them again. Screeching tires, a crash, then silence. Rachel jumped up. That proves nothing. For all we know, this whole thing is staged. Just like these paintings, these stories about abuse. You mean like this? Olivia pressed a button on her phone. A video played on the studio's big screen. Security footage from the gallery showing Daniel with his gun. Your own husband tried to kill you last week, Linda said to Rachel. Yet you claim the stories of abuse are fake? Daniel Parker was never my husband, Olivia said quietly. But Richard Blake was yours, Rachel. You knew exactly what he was capable of. That's why you helped him track down my mother all those years. Rachel's composure cracked. She deserved it. That little nobody, thinking she could walk away from Richard Blake, take his child, ruin everything? Like you tried to ruin Edward. After Richard went to prison, James asked. How many times did you come here, Rachel, trying to convince Edward to merge with Blake Industries? Edward was supposed to be mine, Rachel shrieked, her perfect mask finally shattering. Richard promised me. If Clara hadn't run, if Emma hadn't interfered, if, Olivia stood up, facing Rachel. My mother ran because Richard was a monster. Emma died because she protected us. And you're just another person who helped hurt innocent people for money. You have no idea what it's like, Rachel snarled. Being married to a man like Richard, having to be perfect, having to do whatever he wanted. Actually, I do know, Olivia said softly. She turned to the cameras. That's why I'm using the Blake fortune to open shelters. Safe houses for women and children running from men like Richard and Daniel. Places where they can heal, start over, like Emma tried to help my mother do. Linda wiped tears from her eyes. And the paintings? Will they be part of this project? Yes, Olivia smiled. Art heals. Emma taught me that, even though I didn't know it was her teaching me. Every butterfly-stamped letter, every secret gift of paint and paper, she was showing me the way out of darkness. This is ridiculous, Rachel started, but security guards were already moving toward her. Behind them stood Detective Sarah Martinez. Rachel Blake, Sarah said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy in the death of Emma Harrington. We found your fingerprints on the tape from Richard's safe. You knew about Emma's murder all along. As Rachel was led away screaming, Linda turned back to Olivia. One last question, all these years, all these secrets, was it worth it? Finding out the truth? Olivia looked at Edward, who had tears in his eyes, at Ethan, standing proud behind the cameras, at James finally free of his brother's shadow, at her paintings telling their story in living color. Truth is always worth it, she said. Emma knew that. My mother knew it. Now everyone else will know it too. The cameras kept rolling as Rachel was taken away, as Edward hugged Olivia, as Ethan joined them in a family embrace. But the real story was in the paintings surrounding them. Light conquering darkness, love overcoming hate, truth setting them all free. Later, alone in the studio, Olivia found one last letter in Emma's old desk. It was addressed to her, dated the day Emma died. Dear Olivia, if you're reading this, the truth has finally come out. I want you to know that every secret I kept out of love. For you, for Clara, for the family we could have been. But secrets have a way of poisoning love. That's why I'm meeting your mother tonight. It's time for truth, time for healing, time for my father to know the granddaughter he should have had all along. Whatever happens, remember, you were always loved by your mother, by me, and by the father who should have been yours. Keep painting, little butterfly. Let your light shine. Love, Emma. Olivia held the letter to her heart, looking out at the garden where Edward was showing Ethan how to prune the roses. Their family wasn't what Emma had imagined, but it was real, built on truth, strengthened by love, and somewhere, she knew, Emma was smiling. 1 year later, the garden of the Harrington mansion was in full bloom, just like it had been in Emma's. Paintings, white chairs lined the rose-scented paths, and butterflies danced through the air as if Emma herself had sent them. Olivia stood in front of her mirror in Emma's old room, her room now, adjusting her wedding dress. The butterfly pendant Edward had found in Emma's jewelry box sparkled at her throat. "Ready, Mom?" Ethan appeared in the doorway, handsome in his tuxedo. At 16, he'd grown taller than her, but his eyes were still those of her protective little boy. "Almost," Olivia smiled, touching up her lipstick. "How's Edward doing?" "Nervous," Ethan grinned. "Uncle Thomas is trying to calm him down." Uncle Thomas. So much had changed in a year. After Rachel's arrest and conviction, after Daniel's sentencing to 20 years for attempted murder, their lives had slowly found a new normal. The Blake fortune, now legally Olivia's, had funded 5 new domestic violence shelters across the state. Each one had an art therapy room, and copies of Olivia's paintings hung in their hallways, showing other women that there was hope, that they could survive and thrive. James Blake had retired to Florida, finally at peace now that his brother's crimes had been exposed and justice had been served. But he still called every Sunday, still signed his emails, Uncle James. A knock at the door revealed Martha, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. "Oh, Miss Olivia, you look just like an angel." "No crying," Olivia laughed, hugging her. "You'll make me start and then my makeup will be ruined." Sorry, Martha sniffed. "It's just, Miss Emma would be so happy. She always wanted Mr. Edward to find love again. And now Edward was waiting in the garden, about to marry the woman who'd brought life back to his empty house. The daughter of the woman he'd loved and lost so many years ago, before Richard Blake's jealousy tore them all apart. "The guests are all here," Thomas poked his head in, including some surprise visitors. Olivia followed him to the window. Her heart caught at what she saw. Women, dozens of them, were filing into the back rows. Women from her shelters. Women whose lives she'd touched through her art and her story. They wanted to be here, Thomas explained, to celebrate with the woman who helped them find their own strength. "I see Sarah Chen made it too," Ethan noted, pointing to the famous lawyer who'd helped put Rachel Blake away. She sat next to Detective Martinez, both of them beaming. The wedding music started playing softly. Ethan offered his arm to his mother. "Ready to become Mrs. Harrington?" "Actually," Olivia said quietly, "I'm keeping Parker. It was my mother's name, her real name, before she had to run. Emma helped her choose it. Clara Parker's daughter," Ethan nodded. "The name of a survivor." They walked down the hallway, together, past Olivia's paintings that now hung proudly on the walls, past the studio where she taught art classes to women rebuilding their lives, past the library where Ethan had finally found his dream of becoming a lawyer, inspired by Sarah Chen's fight for justice. At the garden doors, they paused. Through the glass, Olivia could see Edward waiting under an arch of roses. He wasn't the lonely man she'd met that snowy night anymore. His eyes had lost their sadness, replaced by a love that still amazed her. "Mom?" Ethan squeezed her hand. "I want you to know I'm happy, really happy, and I think Emma would be too." Olivia touched her butterfly pendant. "She's here with us, honey, in every painting, every flower, every moment of joy we've found." The doors opened. Sunlight poured in. And as Olivia walked toward her future, she felt surrounded by love, not just from the man waiting for her, or the son beside her, but from all the souls who had helped her find her way here. Clara, who had the courage to run. Emma, who gave her life protecting them. Even Richard, whose fortune now helped other women escape. Their stories were all part of her story, threads in the tapestry of hope she wove with her art and her love. Edward took her hand under the roses. His eyes shone with tears of joy as he whispered, "Welcome home." And Olivia knew, deep in her heart, that this was what Emma had wanted all along. Not just safety or security, but real love, real family, real happiness. Later at the reception, Olivia danced with her new husband while Ethan danced with Martha. Thomas gave a toast that made everyone cry. And through it all, butterflies danced in the garden, their wings catching the light like brush strokes of hope against the summer sky. In Emma's studio, Olivia's studio now. A new painting waited on the easel. It showed a garden full of light, where butterflies led the way to happiness, and love healed all wounds. Below it, Olivia had written the words she'd found in Emma's last letter. Whatever happens, remember, you were always loved. And she was. She is. She always will be. The end.